Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Value podcast. Today, I'm joined once again by Professor John Kloppenborg. How are you doing today?
Well, very well.
Great. So we're focusing on your book, Excavating Q, the History and Setting of the Sayings Gospel. So, Dr. Kloppenborg, from what you've seen in scholarship, do you think there's a lot of different opinions? Do you find that there's different opinions on how long Q was, different reconstructions of Q, what was in it, what was not in it?
Yeah, there's, I guess I would divide the scholarly terrain into kind of three different groups. The persons that I would, or the view that I would call minimal Q, a slightly larger Q, and a much expanded Q. I sometimes call that fat Q. So the difference is, Q, I think, as you know, and as many of your readers and hearers will understand, Q is reconstructed from those materials that Matthew and Luke have that they didn't get from Mark because they're not present in Mark. So much of the Sermon on the Mount material, Sermon on the Plain material, a number of parables, woes against the Pharisees, and so forth. So one can approach the reconstruction of Q either by taking the kind of minimalist position, which is only those materials that are found in both Matthew and in Luke and not in Mark can be assigned to Q. I associate the minimalist position, especially with the very distinguished Belgian scholar Frans Nering, who has a little book called Q Synopsis, and if you look at it, it's really only the Matthew-Luke material, the stuff that Matthew and Luke have, that Mark doesn't have. Now, a slightly bigger version of Q would take into account that it's certainly logically possible that Matthew has sometimes omitted a piece of Q, just as Matthew has omitted pieces of Mark, and that Luke has occasionally omitted pieces of Q, just as Luke has eliminated actually pretty good chunks of Mark. So if one at least admits that logical possibility, then one might come up with some criteria by which to include material that, for example, that appears only in Matthew, but not in Mark or in Luke, or that occurs only in Luke, but not in Matthew. For example, an example of the latter is the parable of the lost coin. Both Matthew and Luke have the parable of the lost sheep, where a person loses one of 100 sheep and goes out and searches for it. And in Luke, that's immediately followed by a parable of a lost coin or a lost drachma. So the question is, has Luke added that to Q? Or has Luke seen this in Q and say, gee, I have another example that I can fabricate myself, namely a parable of the lost drachma? Or is it the case that Matthew saw both parables and decided to take only one of them? And so one can argue, and I have, and a number of others have, that it seems to us more probable that Matthew has omitted the parable of the lost drachma, and that Luke has retained it. And some of the criteria for making that kind of judgment are, first, that the omitted piece stylistically and rhetorically matches the piece to which it's attached. That's certainly the case in the case in the matter of the lost drachma. It's strictly patterned on the lost sheep. That the omitted piece occurs in a Q context, which it certainly does here, and that one can supply plausible reasons for the other evangelist, Matthew in this case, omitting the lost coin. And in Matthew's case, the lost sheep occurs in the context of chapter 18, where Matthew is dealing with the responsibility of leaders, evidently, of churches, to care for those who have gone astray. Now, in the Matthew, it's easy for Matthew to keep the parable of the lost sheep because he's introduced this with a statement to the effect that uh, one has to show solicitude towards the little ones, as he calls them. And then he gives the example of the guy who has 100 sheep and loses one of them, and then goes out and finds them. Now, the lost coin is it's a little bit harder to exploit the metaphorical valences of the lost coin and apply it to a human being, as a lost coin does not wander off. It simply falls into the ground of your house. And so one could suggest at least that Matthew sees the lost coin and says, well, it really doesn't work as a very good illustration of a Christ believer who wanders off, that is, who gets misled and then one needs to go out and search for that lost one. You don't do that with a lost coin. So as I say, one could make, I think, a modest case that that Luke preserves the double parable, and that Matthew has has simply omitted the second parable. So that ends you up with a slightly more robust view, and the International Q Project, uh, which was uh, a collaborative project of 30 or 40 scholars, all of whom worked on Q, arrived at a slightly enhanced version of Q that included a little bit of this Lucan special material and a couple of instances of Matthew's special material, but always um, where we were conscious that you had to come up with good reasons for thinking both that it was in Q and why Matthew or Luke, alternatively, had omitted it from Q. Then there is another version, which is what I've sort of called humorously Fat Q, where much more material that is possibly in Q has been included in it. And that might include everything that Matthew and Luke has by themselves, plus other kinds of material as well. Um, uh, it's a little more difficult to supply what I would think of as controllable criteria for including those extra materials. But Dennis McDonald, for example, has suggested that there was a lot more in Q than either the IQP would uh, would put in it, or people like Franz Nehring would put in a kind of a minimal Q. But these are all points where academics, scholars who work in this area, come up with arguments pro and con, and so that's sort of the three kind of baskets of Q, from a kind of minimal to a modest expansion of about 4,500 words to a rather larger expanded Q. So I would say that the middle position is still probably the most widely held. Um, uh, but there are some people who still argue pretty strongly for a minimal Q.
You mean by the Q document and the Q people? Do you mean that there's a large community of Christians or proto-Christians that followed the Q document only, something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a difficult one to answer. Um, in the first part of the 20th century, there was a tendency to talk about a Q community as if, um, just as scholars talked about the Matthean community and the Lucan community, or the Markan community, or the Johannine community. Um, and that sort of maps a document onto a discrete group of Christ followers. Starting in the the late 1990s, or the early 1990s, a number of scholars, including myself, started to be a little skeptical about this idea of mapping a document onto uh, a discrete group, and even to claim that uh, whoever it is that produced and used Q only knew Q. Um, uh, now, so I've preferred to think about the people who used Q not as as a discrete community located in Sepphoris or Capernaum or something like that, but rather a network of users. Q itself imagines a kind of network. In the middle of Q, you've got this statement about people that it calls the workers, the ergotai, who go out to other villages, and if they're accepted, then they're accepted. If they're rebuffed, then they leave. And uh, Hugh evidently imagines that uh, it finds sympathizers in a number of Galilean villages, and it finds hostile reception in a few other places, including places like Chorazin and Bethsaida and maybe Capernaum. Uh, uh, so I think at this point it's probably safer to think of Q as a document that is used within a network of like-minded persons, um, rather than to imagine a single church, as it were. And so we've migrated away from the term Q community to Q people, which is a happily vague term about who it is we're really talking about, because we don't really know. Uh, uh, Now, the other issue that you raise is a really interesting one. What else does Q know, or the people who use Q? What else do they know as far as documents are concerned? Uh, that's a more difficult thing to understand. Um, and one of the kind of critical issues is, do they think of Jesus as dead and resurrected? That's the Markan conception of Jesus is one of a dying and rising Messiah, Christos. That's also the Pauline notion of a dying and rising Messiah. Uh, Now, if Q knew Mark or knew something like Mark, it's a little bit curious that Q doesn't ever use the term Christos, Christ, to refer to Jesus. Um, and while it knows about an idea of resurrection, that is, it imagines a resurrection in the future, it doesn't. Uh, as far as we can reconstruct it, it doesn't think of Jesus as resurrected. That is, as returned from the dead. It seems to use another metaphor, and that is the metaphor of assumption, um, the kind of thing that happens to Elijah or Enoch. They were and they were not, for God took them. And assumption can happen either prior to death, as it did in the case of Elijah, or after death, in the case of other figures. But that assumption is also a vindication mechanism in the ancient Near East, or actually in the ancient world. That is, persons who are removed to the heavenly realms by the deity. That's that's also an authentication of them, or a vindication of them, just as the Markan notion of the resurrection of Jesus is also understood as a vindication. So uh, it's possible to conceive, and it's a view that I take, that Hugh certainly understands that Jesus has been vindicated post-mortem, but the vindication is really a kind of Enochic, Elijah-anic vindication rather than a Danielic um, resurrection from the dead. And as I say, if Hugh had known Mark, it's curious that it hasn't taken over the dying rising trope and maintains the dying assumption trope.
what about the material that's unique to Matthew and material that's unique to Luke that neither of them have? You mentioned earlier that Luke could have, was it Luke or Matthew? Yeah, that Matthew could have admitted material that was in Q, and Luke could have done the same thing. But what about the L and M documents? How do
Yeah,
you feel
but
about that in this context?
yeah, this is related to this problem. So, you have, for example, if you look at Matthew, you've got Markan material in Matthew, you've got Q material in Matthew, and then you've got this stuff that we call M, which would include the infancy stories, a number of parables, the parable of the 10 virgins or the 10 maidens, the parable of the last judgment, and so forth, and then a number of other sayings, so forth. So the the kind of methodological question is, uh, you know where Matthew has got the Markan material from, because we can compare Matthew and Mark, and we think we know where he's got the Q material from, because it also shows up in Luke. Then the question is, what about the M material? Uh, as I said, it's at least logically possible that some of the M material was in Q and Luke omitted it. And similarly, some of the L material was actually in Q and Matthew omitted it. But there, I think that we have to come up uh, with pretty good criteria for concluding that, if it's going to be a plausible argument. And no one, as far as I know, would include all of the M material in Q, because you'd have to assume that Luke omitted really quite a substantial amount of sayings, and you'd have to then explain why he would omit those. And similarly, I'm not aware of anyone who would argue that Q contained all the L material, because then you'd have to explain why Matthew, who has access to this supposedly very huge Q, would have omitted so much of the L material. That they omitted some a parable here, a saying here, that's at least easier to imagine. Um, but then that raises your question: where did Matthew and Luke get the L material and the M material? Uh, B.H. Streeter in 1924 and others imagined that the M material was a document. So Streeter imagines the composition of Matthew to arise from Matthew having Mark in front of him, having Q in front of him, and having this M document in front of him. And he combines these documents and comes up with a gospel. Uh, I think there's some good reasons to think that wasn't the case. That Mark is a document, I think, is clear enough. I think good arguments can be made to suggest that Q is a document. But if you, just as a thought experiment, if you take a synopsis like Throckmorton's synopsis or Allen's synopsis and extract from it all of the material that appears only in Matthew and try to put it together into a coherent document, you end up with really a kind of dog's breakfast of stuff. It's all over the place, from these infancy stories, and then a parable here, a parable there, an individual saying, uh, bits of the resurrection appearance stories, little bits of the passion story, but you can't actually put it into a document that makes sense as a document. And likewise, if you try to do the same with the L material, you're going to end up with a really miscellaneous group of sayings and stories and parables and bits of narrative and so forth. That's pretty hard to imagine as ever existing as a single document. So the tendency now is to imagine the M and the L material as mostly oral information, maybe little bits of written stuff, but largely oral traditions that Matthew and Luke have variously combined either with Q or with Markan material. And rather than imagining that you've got discrete documents, an M document, an M source, and an L source. There are still a few scholars who want to argue that the M and the L material were actually documents. But in my view, that's a hard argument to make because you end up positing a set of materials, literary materials that don't really make sense as a document.
If you were down there in Israel or the Middle East somewhere, and you were searching for the Q document, where would you go?
Well, it would be lovely. When I dug at Bethsaida, one of my graduate students planted a plastic cube in my square, and so I excavated, and there it was. It was a big laugh, but um, I wouldn't go to I wouldn't go to Capernaum or to Bethsaida or any place in the Galilee for the simple reason that we have zero uh, uh, papyri and parchment documents from that area, and that's simply a function of climate. Um, the climate in Israel, even in the Arava, even in the Dead Sea Rift Valley, is still far, far too wet to preserve biological written material like papyri. So the only place in the east, in the Levant, where it's preserved, where writing materials are preserved at all, are really two places in Egypt. So that's where the Oxyrhynchus papyri come from, the Fayumim papyri. We've got probably 500,000 or more fragments of papyri from Egypt, about 5,000, 6,000 of which have been published now. And then a very few scraps of mostly parchment, but some papyri from down around the Dead Sea, where the year over year precipitation is less than 1 millimeter. So that's the kind of climatological conditions that preserve papyri and parchment, where you've got practically no precipitation at all, or very dry sand as you have in Egypt. So if I were looking for Q, the only place I would look was maybe some caves around the Dead Sea, um, though we don't really have much reason to think that um, the Q people, the Q networks went down that far. But it's conceivable. And the other place I would look is in the unpublished papyri that we have from Egypt. Of course, we've got 3 fragments of the Gospel of Thomas from the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, from there, and those at least have some sort of generic similarities to Q material. They're sayings collections. Um, frankly, I think the likelihood of fragments of Q ever being found is, between uh, slim and zero. Um, and that, we don't have any papyri, Christian papyri from the 1st century at all. Our earliest Christian papyri are the sort of the 3rd quarter of the 2nd century, tiny fragment of Matthew. Um, and then some stuff in the late 2nd century, early 3rd century. So, if Q survived as a discrete document, I suppose it might have made it to Egypt and might be still sitting in the unpublished material in the Sackler Library in Oxyrhynchus, but in Oxford. But I'm not holding my breath.
So back Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for your super sticker. Um, do you think eventually some people could search those libraries to find out if it's there?
Oh yes, the um, your readers may or may not know about the Oxyrhynchus find. This was a find of papyri in 1896 and again in 1907, and the materials were removed to the Sackler Library in in Oxford, and there's about 500,000 uh, fragmentary and fragmentary manuscripts. And every year, the Egypt Exploration Society publishes a volume of Oxyrhynchus papyri. and we're up to volume 70, no, 80, I forget, 77, 78, something like that. Uh, we're up to about 6,000 papyri. We got a long ways to go to get through 500,000 of them at the rate that they're being published. So, every year another batch is examined and published, and you find more biblical papyri. You find lots of classical papyri, copies of Homer and Polemicus and Greek tragedy, and tons of private letters, documentary papyri. So it's certainly not impossible that other early Christian papyri are going to show up. Maybe something like Q, maybe a relative of Q, maybe another sayings collection that we never have heard of or never imagined existed. So that's always possible. At the pace that these are being published, a volume a year with maybe 30 to 100 fragments, it's going to take a long time to get through 500,000. And there are still papyrus collections in Vienna and a few other in Michigan. There's some in Toronto, and the pace of publication is exceedingly slow. So as I say, that's one of the reasons I don't hold my breath waiting for Q to show up, or even another early copy of Matthew or Luke. These come about very, very slowly.
Do you think that the Q document could have been redacted several times? Burton L. Mack, the late Burton L. Mack, thought that Q was written in multiple layers. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
yeah, that's true. And in fact, Mac used a lot of the results from my dissertation to argue that. Um, the the reason for thinking that Q is compositionally composite uh, comes from looking at its contents. So there's uh, there are sort of 6 or so kind of clusters of material that are that are framed as second person plural addresses um, to um, uh, to an imaginary, probably a real audience. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other. These are all second person plural imperatives. Um, and these clusters tend to begin with kind of programmatic sentences like "Blessed are the poor," uh, and "Blessed are you when you're persecuted," and so forth, and then switch into a series of second person plural imperatives, and then end with a peroration, that is, a kind of concluding sentence or concluding visualization, like uh, the one who obeys my words is like one who builds their house on rock, on stone, and the one who disobeys and so forth. So the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So these 6 kind of clusters of sayings have a kind of structural integrity to them, beginning with programmatic sentences, then second person plural imperatives, and then a kind of concluding visualization. You see 6 of these clusters in Q. And then surrounding them, there are sayings that are not so obviously addressed as exhortations to the group, but rather as kind of justifications or defenses or apologetic statements defending the character or nature or credentials of the group, uh, the speakers, and attacking others, attacking outsiders, called this generation. Hugh uses that phrase to refer to those folks who don't recognize uh, um, the Q people or Q or Jesus or whatever. So you find these 2 different kinds of material, and they kind of alternate with one another. Um, and so one question might be, did Q begin as a series of hortatory sayings with this kind of coherent structure that I've outlined, and then been supplemented with other kinds of material that aims at a defense of the ethos of the few people? That's a view that I've taken. That's a view that you'll see in Burton Mack, and some others have taken that view. Others say, well, why couldn't Q have been simply composed all at once with both kinds of materials, um, uh, taking this kind of alternating compositional strategy where you have some communal directed materials interspersed with apologetic materials. That's clearly possible. Um, I point out that if we look at comparable materials, let's say um, the book of Proverbs, I think there's a wide consensus now, and maybe it's even a universal consensus, that the book of Proverbs is not a single composition. Proverbs 1 to 9 takes one kind of literary form, this same form, which is called technically an instruction, which begins with programmatic sentences, then second person imperatives, then kind of including visualizations. But then from Proverbs 10 to 10 to 31, you get more just individual sentences, except for Proverbs 22:16 to 24:22, which again is one of these instructional compositions, which in that case bears remarkable similarities to the Egyptian sentences of Amenemope, and there's probably some kind of literary relationship between the Egyptian collection and the Proverbs collection. So these kinds of sentence collections, Sirach is the same, Proverbs is the same, and we've got Egyptian collections that are similarly heterogeneous in the sense that they've clearly been supplemented at certain points in their compositional history. Um, though the view that Q is composite, um, undergoing expansions of various sorts, is is at least coherent with what we understand about other Near Eastern sentence collections, where you see the same kind of phenomena of mixtures of genre and indications that you've got uh, add-ons and insertions and so forth into earlier collections. But I do want to say that um, this is all hypothetical. That is most of what we do in scholarship on Christian origins is hypothetical. You start with a data set, in this case, the double tradition material in Matthew and Luke, and then you try to make sense of it in a relatively plausible way in terms of its compositional history. And this type, the approach that Mac has taken, or I've taken, and others have taken, is one way of trying to make sense of complexity. Um, and other colleagues of mine say, well, I think a single author could imagine that complexity. So we're all working with literary hypotheses that try to come up with sort of pleasing compositional scenarios. And this is not something that I'm going to go to the wall about. There's nothing dogmatically that hangs on it. But it's a matter of imagining how composition actually happens.
Do you think that the author or authors of the Q document knew earlier written material about Jesus?
They certainly knew some. They obviously knew some material about Jesus. Whether it was written, I don't know. Uh, the uh, the 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 grounds for positing that they knew something written would be that a certain, say, a cluster or a sub-collection within Q finds a parallel in another document that is clearly written. Um, um, so let me see. For example, in the I think probably second century document, the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles. There's a chunk at the beginning of the Didache from Didache 1:3 to 2:1, which looks like it's cribbing sayings from the final version of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Whereas other materials in the Didache, um, those sections don't look like they know any at least gospel material. Um, so the reason for thinking that that first chunk of the Didache it goes back to a document is that the agreements, the verbal agreements that you find in that first section of the Didache 1, they cohere so strongly with the written versions of Matthew and Luke that you're probably obliged to say whoever put that part of the Didache into the Didache had a documentary source, namely Matthew and Luke, in front of him. Whereas whoever put together other parts of the Didache, earlier parts of the Didache, didn't have access to written materials. And you can do this with other early Christian documents. You can ask, say, whether Justin Martyr has written versions of the Gospels in front of him. He certainly knows about them. And does he have a written version of the Gospel of John in front of him? Because he doesn't seem to know that. And he quotes sayings that look a little bit like John, but they're not close enough to be John to suggest that he's actually got a copy of John in front of him. So, you have to adjudicate all these possibilities on a case-by-case basis and ask whether you've got sufficient evidence to posit access to a written source rather than access to orally circulated materials.
There are some scholars that also think that there's a source called I think they call it the passion source of some kind
Yeah.
of proto-gospel that the synoptic gospels copied from some of their biographical information about Jesus. What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is a view of John Dominic Crossan, uh, who wrote a book on the cross gospel, where he thinks that that the Passion narrative derived from an earlier document whose contours you can kind of perceive in the synoptic Passion narrative in John and the Gospel of Peter, which is the bits that we have of Peter as a kind of Passion gospel. Um, uh, that's not a view that I personally hold, but there's certainly data that he adduces that um, that at least makes that hypothesis partly believable. Um, it's very it's intriguing that if you look at the synoptic, the Johannine, and the Gospel of Peter Passion narratives, each of them uh, refers to a series of texts from the Psalms. Psalm 22, this is where my God, why have you forsaken me, comes from, and a few other texts. Psalm 34, Psalm 42, Psalm 69. Um, and he's certainly right, and this goes back to observations of Howard Key and George Nicholsburg, that one of the kind of backbones of the Passion narratives, plural, uh, is a kind of texture of psalms. These are all called the Psalms of the Righteous Sufferer, which where the psalmist basically complains about the awful things that are happening to him, calls upon God, and they all end with a kind of resolution, the triumph of the persecuted one in the sight of his enemies and so forth. So it's really interesting that these Passion narratives all revert to this kind of texture of psalm texts. The complexity is they don't use the same psalm texts. Um, and so, if you were to reconstruct a kind of proto-Passion narrative, would you include all of those psalm texts and create a kind of narrative out of them? Or is it the case that early Christian writers who wanted to write a story, a version of the death of Jesus, all had the same kind of basic idea that let's use this collection of Psalms of the Righteous Sufferer to create a narrative of the death of Jesus, but they make slightly different choices of which psalm texts to use, and therefore come up with somewhat different accounts. They're they're alike in the sense that they're using the same basically fund of literary resources, the Psalms, but they make slightly different choices. Um, Personally, I think it's probably the latter, that early Christians got the idea that the Psalms of the Righteous Sufferer were good ways to think about the death of Jesus. And so the Synoptic narrative, which basically goes back to Mark, is a little bit different than the Johannine narrative, and different again from the Gospel of Peter narrative. But there's also been cross-fertilization happening at certain points too. So this is a really interesting, complicated, and very messy problem to work out. There's, as far as I can tell, there's not a clean solution of whether there's a single document there or really a kind of interesting common practice in creating the narrative that accounts for the similarities that exist.
What about the minor agreements between Matthew and Luke? Could that be the result of another document that may have contained them?
Yeah, the minor agreements are the kind of crux for the two document hypothesis, because if Matthew and Luke are independently using Mark, that is, Matthew doesn't see what Luke has done to Mark, and Luke hasn't seen what Matthew's done to Mark. And ditto with Q. They both used Q, but they've used Q independently. Then one should expect, logically, that Matthew and Luke won't agree with each other against Mark, except coincidentally. That is, by coincidentally, I mean that I think, as many know, Mark's grammar is not very good. Mark tends to connect sentences with and rather than properly subordinated conjunctions. And both Matthew and Luke have a strong tendency to correct that by introducing proper subordination. So logically speaking, Matthew and Luke might coincidentally sometimes correct Mark in the same way. That's not so much a problem, but what is a problem is when Matthew and Luke end up with a same string of words, say 5 or 6 words in the same order that they haven't gotten from Mark because it's not in Mark. The classic example is in the Passion narrative, where Matthew and Luke uh, both have Jesus being blindfolded and struck, and the tormentors say, "Prophesy, who struck you?" That's not in Mark. The blindfolding is there, but the taunt, "Prophesy, who struck you," isn't in Mark. So Matthew and Luke apparently didn't get it from Mark, and yet they come up with exactly the same phrase. That's a classic example of a so-called minor agreement, an agreement that really shouldn't exist if Matthew and Luke are entirely independent of one another. Now, there have been several different ways of addressing the problem of the minor agreements. One is uh, one is to say, well, actually, they did get it from Mark, but a version of Mark which we no longer have. So that's a logically possible solution, but it's kind of positing a version of Mark in order to solve the minor agreements. Another solution is to say this is textual corruption. We don't have an original Matthew or original Mark or original Luke. What we've got is second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand copies of all these. And in the process of transmission, it certainly is possible, and in fact it's well attested, that there's cross-fertilization that occurs um, between one gospel stream and another gospel stream. So there's hardly uh, a text, there's hardly a sentence in the Gospels, say the Gospel of Luke, where you can't see in the manuscript tradition that some copyist has contaminated Luke by a reading from Matthew. Um, so you might say that prophesy who struck you is actually a textual assimilation of Luke to Matthew by a scribe who knows that phrase is in Matthew and sticks it into this copy of Mark. So that kind of thing happens. Uh, Another solution is that it's the influence of oral tradition. Um, uh, or as advocates of the Farrer hypothesis argue, it's evidence that Luke has seen Matthew. That is, Luke has used Matthew as a source. Now, if you do that consistently, then you've eliminated the need for positing Q. But there's another version that still keeps a Q, but posits that at some point in the in the transmission and the composition of Luke has, Matthean stuff has kind of filtered through and been used by Luke. So there's a couple of other variations that try to account for why those minor agreements appear. Uh, the difficulty, in my view, is not that we've got minor agreements, but that we don't know which of about 6 or 7 possible explanations is the better one to account for one. To account for one, and each of those explanations has a certain kind of a priori probability, um, but we don't know how to choose between the various solutions to it. It's a little bit like problems in theoretical physics, where, as you know, light has 2 opposed properties. One of them is it has wavelength, which means it has frequency, but it also has particular or quantum characteristics. It's a little bit hard to imagine how it can have both at the same time, except that it does. And coming up with a pleasingly rational visualization of how that is the case is difficult for us, because maybe we don't have the cognitive capacity to understand that. And it's a little bit like that in dealing with a number of theoretical problems in gospel studies, where there's always counter data that you have to account for in some way. And you come up with various explanations for that counter data. And none of those explanations is, I would say, compelling. Uh, you know, a certain explanation is the obvious one that makes sense of this. That's unfortunately not the case, and it's not the case often in history, right? Where, we probably lack more relevant data in history than we have data to work with. I mean, that is, there are bigger holes in our data set than there are in our data set. Um, and that means that we end up not being able to understand why certain events happened, or uh, why things are the way they seem to have been. I think you, as a historian, probably understand that well. And the farther we go back in history, the more holes there are, and therefore the more puzzles we're left with.
If you had to choose a solution to the minor agreements problem, what would you think is the most probable?
Um, well, I'm tempted. There's a German scholar whose name is Andreas Engelbach, and he did his doctoral dissertation on minor agreements. And what he observed was that if you look collectively at the minor agreements, or what he identifies about, I forget, around 20 or so, what he calls serious minor agreements, things like prophesy, restructure. Um, he argued that if you look at them in terms of their literary function, they all look to be post-Markan. I mean that is, they look to be developments of Mark that clarify Mark in one way or another. And so he posits what is called a Deuteromarcus hypothesis. That is, our Mark is pretty close to the original Mark, and in the process of the copying or use of Mark, um, it got elaborated and clarified or expanded in a few ways, including, let's say, prophesy, restructure, and a few other places. And that was the Mark that Matthew and Luke used. So they're not using our Mark; they're using a slightly expanded Mark, and that is what creates the problem of the minor agreements. It looks like They're coincidentally including stuff that Mark doesn't have. They're actually including stuff that Deuteromark did have. Uh, so it was a very carefully done dissertation, and I think made a plausible argument that all of the minor agreements look like they're post-Markan. That is, they look like they're a development of Mark. And that being the case, um, that looks like a good solution. On the other hand, um, there's another wrench that's been thrown into the mixture by the work that's been done on Marcion's Gospel. Um, uh, by Jason Badun and Marcus Vincent and Matthias Klinghardt, who have all argued that um, the earlier notion that Marcion had taken the Gospel of Luke and adulterated it is probably false. It's more likely the case that Marcion drew on an earlier or pre-Lucan Gospel. Um, and which can be partly reconstructed. Now, one of my colleagues and former student, Daniel Smith, uh, came up with an article a few years ago in which he pointed out that the reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel has the effect of eliminating the minor agreements, or most of them. Now, that's very interesting because that might suggest that uh, our 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 Luke has been, uh, you can explain some of the minor agreements that occur in Luke as contamination, as probably manuscript contamination from Matthew. So that's a different kind of explanation. That doesn't need to posit a Deuteromarcus. It it locates the problem of the minor agreements really in the post-Lucan transmission of the Gospel of Luke, where contamination from Matthean readings can explain those. So I think there's not been enough work done on seeing whether Daniel Smith's hypothesis is going to work for all of the minor agreements. But that's one way. That's one possible way of solving it. Of course, if you had Mark Goodacre being interviewed here, he would say, well, the minor agreements are solved more easily by saying that Luke has seen the Gospel of Matthew, and that's why those agreements exist. Now, that certainly does the trick. It creates its own series of problems because then you have to explain why Luke doesn't agree with Matthew in so many places, where one would normally think that he would simply take over Matthean formulations, which he hasn't done. So, each of these solutions is a kind of partial solution that explains one subset of the data. But the problem is it doesn't explain it all. And so we're left with a good deal of uncertainty about how to deal with that phenomenon.
Since you brought up Jason Bodun, Matthias Klinghardt, and Marcus Vincent, that makes me curious. What do you think of Marcion priority? That Marcion's gospel is first, and that the Synoptics and John copied it.
I don't think that works, and that's Klinghardt's view, that the Evangelion of Marcion becomes the source of the others.
Yeah.
I don't think that works very well. Um, but there are other versions of this, the Dune, for example, where Marcion's gospel still figures importantly in understanding the relationship between how Luke came about. Um, uh, that um, uh, that I think that explanation might have some legs, but it's complicated by the fact that we don't have Marcion's gospel. Marcion's gospel is already a construct from uh, Tertullian, what Tertullian says, or what Tertullian supposedly quotes of Marcion's gospel, what Epiphanius quotes, and what Pseudo-Adamantius quotes. And so you take these uh, third, fourth, and fifth century opponents of Marcion, who all quote bits of Marcion's gospel. The problem is they don't agree with one another on what they attribute to the gospel. So it becomes a very difficult matter to actually decide what was in Marcion's gospel and what wasn't. Dieter Roth, now at Boston College, did his dissertation under Larry Hurtado on this and comes up with a construction of, or at least a discussion of how to reconstruct Marcion's gospel, taking into account these disagreements um, of what was supposedly in it and what supposedly wasn't in it. So that makes any kind of firm conclusions about the relationship of Marcion's gospel to Luke and to the other gospels difficult, because it's, you're dealing with something that is pretty fuzzy around the edges as to what Marcion actually, what the Marcionite, or let's call it the pre-Marcionite, the pre-Marcion gospel, what it had in it. Um, but I do think that is going to become a part of the synoptic problem discussions in the future, and that's probably will provoke some adjustments to the simplicity of the two document hypothesis with its, Mark, Hugh, Matthew, Luke. To factor Marcion in there is going to complicate things. Exactly how it's going to complicate them, I don't know at this point, but I'm pretty sure that it will.
Is it possible, in your view, that Matthew and Luke's minor agreements, or could be evidence that Matthew and Luke knew Marcion's gospel, assuming that that the theory that Marcion's gospel had the minor agreements holds up, so they copied Marcion Mark?
Yeah, well, Smith's point is that Marcion's gospel seems to lack the minor agreements. So, but which would then raise the question: why do we have them now in Matthew, Luke? So that's why I think that on Smith's view, or the it's the minor agreements perhaps are a matter of textual contamination. But as I say, also since the exact contours of Marcion's gospel are not always very clear, what you suggest is possible. Maybe that's where they come from. Maybe there's some kind of interference of Marcion's gospel on Matthew and Luke, or on Matthew and or Luke, that create this problem. Um, this is, I think this is going to be the next generation of synoptic scholars that are going to have to work very hard with Marcion's gospel, or the pre-Marcionite gospel, and start to figure out exactly how it fits. Um, you've got a kind of parallel problem with the Gospel of Thomas, which has early Jesus material and some later Jesus material, and sorting out how to plug that in to a schema diagram of how the Gospels are arranged. That it becomes a difficult matter, and in part because we've got most of the Gospel of Thomas only in Coptic, not in Greek. Um, and so sorting out what the full Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas actually look like is more difficult, and then becomes harder to relate it to the Greek versions of the Synoptic Gospels. Um,
So
there's
basically,
different problems all around here.
what you're saying is another way it could have gone is that the original Matthew and Luke were ignorant of one another and they copied Mark and Hugh independently, but later, due to contamination and editing, Scrabble interference, editors of Matthew and Luke used each other, or one used the other, and
Yeah,
so it made it look like that one gospel copied the other when it didn't, because the original form didn't.
yeah, that's an entirely plausible scenario, because we know from looking at manuscripts that scribes did this. A classic example is, if you look at later copies of the Gospel of Luke, where it comes to the Lord's Prayer, uh, you know, Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, I think, uh, is the short version with simply Father, not our Father who is in the heavens, May your name be holy, may your kingdom come, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us, and don't put us to the test. So it doesn't have the triadic structure that the Matthean Lord's Prayer has. But we've got plenty of manuscripts of Luke's Gospel where you find the Matthean version of the Lord's Prayer. And I think that that's explicable uh, by the kind of psychology of copying. That is, the scribe who, if they're a monk, they pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. They know exactly how it is, and it's the Matthean version that they're praying. And so when they come to the words, when you pray, say, they say, well, I know what it says, and they copy Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer uh, into it, and thus, in a way, contaminate the Lucan version, they overwrite the Lucan version. That occurs in dozens and dozens of points in the Gospel of Luke where you get a Matthean reading, or sometimes a Johannine reading intruding into the text. And that's because um, scribes know the other 3 Gospels, and when they're copying one, readings from the others tend to leak in. Uh, so that's a pretty well-known phenomenon. It's called harmonization. Uh, and when one as a text critic goes about the process of reconstructing, the earlier or the better versions, you you know that harmonization occurs, and you select non-harmonistic variants. That is, because you know that scribes tend to harmonize, and so if you've got a variant that is not harmonized, that doesn't show harmonization, you select that as the better one. So it's the same. It's the same kind of issue with the minor agreements. If the minor agreements may be due to scribal harmonization of copies of Luke, they're harmonized towards Matthew, and that creates the minor agreements. Now, it's certainly a known phenomenon in copying of manuscripts, and there's no a priori reason why it wouldn't happen, let's say, in the 3rd century by copyists of Luke. Um, uh, as I say, it's certainly a plausible solution. Um, our difficulty is from moving to plausible or possible solutions to solutions that we're willing to go to the wall with, and there we don't have good enough evidence or argument to do that.
Do you think it's For a moment there, I lost what I was going to say. Okay. Oh, there it is. Longer mark. Do you think the longer ending of mark is an example of what you're talking about, Scrabble interference? Because some suggest a longer mark is trying to harmonize the ending of Mark's gospel with the later gospels.
Yeah, it's certainly, um, Mark ends in. I mean, we think that the original of the Gospel of Mark ends at verse 8, 16:8, which is a very peculiar ending, right? So 3 times already in Mark, Jesus has predicted uh, that he will die and rise. Um, and in 14:27, and I go before you to Galilee, and there you will see me. So it's very peculiar when Mark has, the young man say he's risen, he's not here, and the women run away, and don't tell anything to anybody, for they were afraid. That's how Mark ends. Boy, what an interesting ending. And so one, I think, can see that copyists who know the endings of the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, and John, who have resurrection appearance stories, they come to Mark, and they come to, and they said nothing to anyone before they were afraid, and say, that can't be the ending. And so you create another ending where there's an appearance story, and that that uh, that finishes off the gospel in a more pleasing way, especially because the gospel has already predicted, at 14:27, that there will be some kind of uh, uh, reunion of Jesus and his disciples in Galilee. I mean, 14:27 says that. So you can see that the scribe looks at the Gospel of Mark and says, that can't be the way it ended. It must have ended somewhere else, in some other way, and so they supply it. So this is an entirely plausible scenario that a scribe has created an ending for it.
Thanks for joining me once again today, Dr. Kloppenborg. And I thank everybody else that participated in the live chat. And I'll see all of you later. The next time Dr. Kloppenborg will join us on the next live stream he appears on, and we're going to be talking about Luke's geography. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.